Nice to meet you.
We're glad to see you in the frame of the project City as a Classroom.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for speaking English. My Russian is quite rusty.
Jeff, when I found your book, Walkable City, I thought, what a comprehensive definition. In Russian, it is translated as a city for pedestrians, and which is slightly changed the meaning.
Yes.
Yes, I think that everyone should read this book, not only architects and city planners, but for those who haven't read this book yet, could you please tell us briefly about what the main idea of the general theory of walkability?
Absolutely. You know, that the change in the translation is important, I think, because you know, a pedestrian is one type of user of a city, and changing the title to City of Pedestrians, I think, limits who you're serving, when it's important to understand that a pedestrian isn't so much a person or a user as being a pedestrian is something that we all do at some point. So most of us, at least in the US, most of us have cars, most of us are drivers. We are cyclists, maybe half of us are cyclists. We are transit users, and we are pedestrians. We're all those things at once. But saying walkable city, in other words, a city that enables walking, is very different from saying a pedestrian city, because a pedestrian city is one which is for pedestrians exclusively, perhaps. A walkable city just means a city in which walking is a viable way of living your life, which of course in larger cities means walking and transit. Because you can't walk the full length of a larger city, right? So you can't, it wouldn't be normal to walk from one side of Odessa to the other just to go to a meeting. So the walkable city is a city in which one can have a lifestyle that includes a lot of walking that is useful to them. But it's not a city just for pedestrians. It's a city for everyone. The idea of the theory of walkability, and I should, again, another introductory comment, I should say my book was very much written for North America. And I didn't realize it would attract such a large audience. People are reading it and it's being translated all over the world. And I'm surprised to find that people find so many of these American issues are applicable to them, but I believe that they are. My general theory of walkability, which was oriented around the American situation, is it asks the question, how do we get people to make the choice to walk? Most often when people think about walkability or the ability to walk, they're asking whether walking is actually possible. I'm not interested so much in if walking is possible as if people will make the choice to walk, because there's many places where walking is possible, but it's very unpleasant or unattractive. And certainly in America, so many people own cars that if the walk isn't completely attractive in every way, they will then make the choice to drive. And if those of us who can drive do drive, then the city ends up being designed around us driving, and it isn't good for anyone else because the streets get wider, you know, the pedestrian facilities get worse, and biking isn't really considered. So the general theory of walkability says if people are going to make the choice to walk, the walk must be as good as the drive. And if the walk's going to be as good as the drive, it needs to do four things simultaneously. It needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. And I'm happy to get into each of those individually if you like. But walkability as I approach it, which you might call deep walkability, means that you're satisfying all those criteria. You're not just creating a path for walking, you're not just making that path safe, but you're also making it useful, comfortable, and interesting.
Okay, thank you. So, what do you think of such a strange and very beautiful city like Venice? I mean, anthropologically and physiologically, people are used to living on the ground, walking, riding horses, driving a car. It is very strange and quite difficult to build a city on the water.
Even I'm quite amazed that Venice just exists as a city. You know, there are cities like Amsterdam that actually have, Amsterdam has more miles of canals than Venice. but they still feel like cities in which the water has been hollowed out of the city, right? It feels like it's a city, and then there are canals that have been subtracted from the land. Venice feels very much like a city that has been placed on the water, even though the way the two cities grew is not all that different. Venice happens, it's funny you asked this, and I didn't prompt you to do so. Venice happens to be my favorite city. Not during tourist season, because it completely transforms itself under the weight of tourism, but it's also a city which is in danger of, as you know, disappearing because of climate change, or at least becoming very difficult to inhabit. But Venice is one of the very few cities in the Western world that people are familiar with which don't have automobiles in it, or at least don't have automobiles in the center of it, or the main part of it. And it teaches an amazing lesson about what life can be like without these large, threatening steel boxes moving around everywhere. But I'm not an expert on the construction of cities like Venice, and I don't exactly know how it happened. But I'm guessing, like most similar cities, it was ground, but it was kind of swampy. And by placing the water into deeper channels, we were able to then build up the other areas so that they became solid. But I do love Venice.
So let's imagine an experiment. We take two persons. One person is sent for a year to the most walkable city, and the other person will send for a year for the non-walkable city. And what kind of changes will take place in their lifestyles, in their health, in their social contacts, finances? What it will be?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question, and no one has ever asked me that question before. But I think my books and my research have done a lot to answer that question, and we have a lot of data. It's not about people who are sent to different places, but examining how living in more walkable and less walkable places impacts people's health, their wealth, their sustainability, their sociability, and the equity of that society. In Walkable City, in my newer book, Walkable City Rules. Now, Walkable City was translated into Russian.
Yes.
And you can get it in Russian. Walkable City Rules was recently translated into Ukrainian.
Yes.
So my newest book, for some bizarre reason, exists now as a Ukrainian publication. It just came out, and that's amazing to me. But I talk about the 5 reasons why we need to make our cities more walkable. And they are wealth, health, sustainability, equity, and community. And I'll address just a few of those to answer your question. They did an amazing study in China. In China, there are more people that want to have cars than are allowed to have cars. And they had a random lottery. I read about this 6 months ago. They have a random lottery, and certain people receive the right to own a car, and other people don't. And it's completely randomized, so you're zeroing out every other factor that might have an impact on your life. Certain people get cars, certain people don't get cars. They found that among the people who received the cars, or received the right to purchase cars, if they were over 50 years old, they, over the subsequent years, pretty quickly, the ones who received cars gained 20 more pounds, so almost 10 more kilos in weight, than the ones who didn't receive the cars. Weight is only one factor, of course. In the US, we have a tremendous obesity problem, and so many of our other illnesses like cancer and heart disease and diabetes stem from our physical weight. So it's a clear correlation between car ownership and actually the length of your commute, the amount that you're driving, and your health. It's a negative correlation. So that's one category. And of course, there's a lot to be said about air quality and asthma and other health threats that the car presents. In the US, of course, it's our poorer citizens, and very often our citizens of color, African Americans and Hispanics, who are living in the places closest to highways, and their health outcomes are much worse. Their lives are shorter. Their asthma rates are much higher because they're located where all these cars are driving. The person who lives in the more walkable city is also going to have more friends than the person who lives in the less walkable city. The sociologist Donald Appleyard, back in the 1980s, did studies of people who lived on streets that had more traffic or less traffic. And this is something that I document in Walkable City Rules. The people who lived on the streets with less traffic, and these streets were otherwise identical city streets with typical row houses and apartment buildings. The people who lived on the streets with less traffic, on average, said that they had 3 or 3.1 friends. The people who lived on the streets with more traffic averaged 0.9 friends. When you ask them, how many good friends do you have? That's a very dramatic impact based just on whether they felt comfortable walking on their streets or not, whether the streets were walkable or not. And then, of course, we find in our cities that it is people of color and people of lower incomes and older people are being killed much more by in car crashes. And so a city with less driving is one in which you're having greater equity, and people of less means aren't victimized as much by their environment. So those are just a few of the categories. An interesting study in terms of wealth, an interesting study showed that per capita, per person, denser cities, cities with more people in them, generate more patents. So patent generation, which is an indication of scientific research and innovation, is a function of density. Generally, if you're spread out, which the automobile automatically causes cities to do, right? The car causes cities to spread out, then the spreading out causes people to drive cars, and it just keeps going. When cities are more spread out, there's less, the molecules don't bump into each other as much. There's less germination, less invention, and fewer patents. So that's a discussion of wealth. And then you didn't ask about this, but of course, the more that you can rely on your 2 feet and on your bicycle and on transit to get around, the less you are impacting climate change and global heating. So that's a factor as well.
Thank you very much. You wrote that the mortality rate in old and small cities is lower than in new ones. Why is this so? Does walkability affect the criminal situation in the city and the level of safety in general?
I believe I wrote that the mortality rate in older cities is lower than in newer ones. I wouldn't say that's necessarily related to the size of the city. It's related to the amount of driving that the city asks us to do. Mm-hmm. So security and safety, I can't speak to the situation in Ukraine. I can say that my Jewish ancestors fled Ukraine because their safety was not good. And you know the history of that. There was a time in Ukraine when crime and being attacked by strangers was more of an issue than it is now. The same thing in the United States. When we used to talk about safety and security, we talked about, or really, when we used to talk about safety, we talked about crime and murder and being attacked and mugged in the streets. Now when we talk about safety, we talk about our real threats to safety, which are essentially being hit by vehicles. There was a marvelous study of several different North American cities that I mentioned in my book, Walkable City, where they looked at these different cities. It included Vancouver in Canada, Seattle in the US, and I believe San Francisco, but subsequently the same study was done in many other North American cities. And what they did was they looked at the more urban parts of the city and the older parts of the city, which had lots of blocks and streets and small streets and buildings and the way that we used to design our cities. Then they looked at the suburban areas, which were often wealthier and leafy and beautiful. And they said they combined the two things that people talked about. They combined death by stranger, so being killed by someone who's not your spouse, because you're most likely to be killed by your spouse. We won't talk about that. Death by stranger and death by automobile. And they found that when you combine those factors together, you're much safer in the dirtiest, grittiest, oldest most poor part of your city than you are in the leafy, what we call the country club suburbs. You know, the country club suburbs where everyone's got 2 or 3 cars and is living high on the hog and makes a lot of money. You're actually physically safer in the poor inner city than you are in that location, because you're less likely to be found dead in a pool of blood from getting in a car crash. In fact, crime, in our country at least, crime is statistically insignificant as a cause of death compared to car crashes. So again, you know, the issue of safety points us back to our more traditionally organized cities in which driving isn't necessary. I realize in answering your questions that this has become a very anti-car discussion. And in fact, you know, I grew up loving cars. I still enjoy my automobile. And cars are just amazing inventions. And my training isn't in anything around transportation, it's around designing cities. But it so happens that as I've studied cities over the years, I could not help but over and over again reach the conclusion that the car is the problem. That owning cars is not the problem, and many of us can still make that choice, but designing cities around the car is what has caused so many of the problems we currently face in our societies.
Yes, absolutely. If we look at the city as a classroom, what do cities teach its residents? Or maybe we can say that some cities are like classrooms and other cities like theaters, like galleries.
I think if we live in cities, cities teach us everything that we learn. Cities are the most complex and largest things that humans design and build. And so they have so much to teach us. You know, Thomas Jefferson, the famous American, no, it was Winston Churchill. Sorry, Winston Churchill said, we create our buildings and then our buildings create us. And he could have been saying that even more pointedly about the cities that we create. But the simple answer is that not only what we know, but who we are is very much a function of our environment. And the most obvious example of that is if you look at the politics and the open-mindedness and the willingness to, for example, to the interest in studying other countries, the interest in expanding your mind, the interest in interacting with people from all over the world or from different disciplines. If you live in an older city, which is, at least in the US, is a much more diverse place than a newer suburb, you're going to, in the course of your daily life, naturally bump into people of different incomes, of different races, of different ages. Much more so than is in the case of many of our homogeneous settlements that are in our newer cities. In our new, you know, the apotheosis of the automobile-oriented landscape and of the development profession in at least the United States for the past 50 years has been the reorganization of the landscape into large areas of single use and single activity. So not only are offices separated from shopping, and shopping separated from housing, and housing separated from, you know, recreation, everything in its own pod, but also, and I don't know if you do this there, I'm guessing you have started to do this, you'll have a housing pod where every single house costs, you know, hundreds of houses, every single house costs $300,000. You'll have a pod nearby where every single house costs $200,000. Now, another pod where it's you know, $2,000 a month rent, another pod where it's nothing but mansions. And these pods have their own schools, they have their own recreation facilities. Children growing up in these monocultures, in these homogeneous settlements, barely get to witness the other except on television. And their experience of the other is mediated through those devices, and it's not real. So, you know, cities make us the kind of people we are because they subject us to diversity of age, income, race, and thought, or they don't. And I would argue that a human who has that experience is a much more progressive and kind human than one that doesn't.
Jeff, I have one more question.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting. You have changed the look of many cities. Please tell us what were the most interesting citizens' reviews you received after your work?
Citizens reviews?
Yes.
Well, I can tell you a couple things. The first is that people are always wary of new developments and new growth near them. The experience of growth in the United States over the past 50, 60 years has been generally that growth is bad. The promise of suburbia, which is isolation for everybody, right? The suburban house is modeled on the country house, which is supposed to be alone in the countryside and not surrounded by more of the same. So suburbia in itself is self-contradictory, which is isolation en masse, right? Everyone's isolated together. The experience of suburbia has been, when you're selling privacy and you're selling exclusivity, then every additional house that you sell undermines the quality of that asset. Of course, when you're selling community, every single house or apartment that you sell makes that asset stronger. But the tradition of the most recent, half century of American growth has been the suburban model, so that people are very wary of new neighbors. They don't want new neighbors. They imagine that anyone new who comes near them is going to make their life worse. I'll mention just one project I worked on. It's a project called Ion. It's a new village outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And the neighbors and the neighboring subdivisions to this development were very strongly against it. Their developments were all single-family houses and picket fences, no shops, no row houses, no apartments. This project had houses of all different sizes, different incomes, row houses, which are houses that touch, single-family houses, stores, restaurants, and the neighbors were all up in arms. We can't have these things next to us. They're not the same as what we are. And they fought the project, and they fought it through the whole approvals process. It took many years. And when the project was approved, they sued it, took it to court. It took another 5 years of lawsuit to make it approved. It was finally approved. It was built. It was populated very quickly. It's gorgeous. We saved almost every tree on the property. And the people in the neighboring subdivision, the person who fought it the most ended up moving in, bought a house, lives there now. When people in the neighboring subdivisions now are trying to sell their houses, if they're moving away, in the ad for their house, they will say located next to Ion, because that's the #1 selling point. And so that's the most satisfying thing as a planner, is to see the people who fought you to turn around and move in. The other side of that is a lot of the work that I do in existing cities, it's not developing a new place, it's making a place safer and better. The biggest impediment I often have to making changes to make streets safer is the police chief and the fire chief. They're very concerned about moving their vehicles very quickly. And the rules that fire departments in particular have, and police departments, around the design of streets often makes those streets wider and wider and wider, so that cars go faster and more people get killed. A couple of projects I did, but one in a town called New Albany, Indiana, which is located next to Louisville, Kentucky. They were very reluctant to do it. It was a redesign of the street grid. We have a lot of cities in the US where the streets have been turned into multi-lane one-way streets. So you have cars all going in the same direction in multiple lanes. You can jockey from lane to lane. It becomes like a road race. And a lot of the projects I do revert that back to two-way traffic and just one lane in each direction, making it much slower and calmer. They finally, after fighting the changes for maybe 3 years, they made all the changes over a summer. They reverted almost every street in the city from one-way to slower two-way. And I went there last year, and the police chief said that this was the best change for public safety he'd ever seen in his career. So again, when people are resistant and then they come around, that's the most satisfying experience.
Jeff, thank you very much for your time, for this exciting conversation.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation. Your questions were great, and I hope that this is useful to people in Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great talking with you.
Very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.